Chapter 51, Blood of My Blood. Several days after their conversation about Westeros, Vlad had finally finished gathering his blood essence. It was this essence that would transform Daenerys, like him, into a progenitor, his equal, his eternal bride. In practice, there were different ways to create vampires. The majority involved giving the blood of the sire or creator to a human, either replacing all of their blood or just a part of it. Generally, the only difference this caused was shortening the transformation and awakening process. But Vlad, being a progenitor, could accelerate it naturally, so he usually used the first method. It was less cumbersome. However, if he wanted Daenerys to be his equal, those methods were out of the question. Fortunately, he had total control over his abilities and an encyclopedic knowledge of his own nature, so he knew how to achieve it. No vampire in history had ever attempted such a thing. Being a progenitor meant occupying the pinnacle of the vampire hierarchy, and giving up that privilege was unthinkable. What immortal being would sacrifice their absolute dominion? Vlad, however, was no ordinary vampire. In this world, where his lineage was the only one that existed, there was no reason to fear another of his kind. Daenerys would be his wife, not a rival. Furthermore, it would take centuries before she mastered her abilities with the skill he possessed. After all, Vlad had been designed to be the epitome of his species. A subterranean room in the Great Pyramid of Mirian had been prepared for the ceremony. To be honest, it didn't need such fanfare. It wasn't a ritual. Vlad could have simply given her his essence and laid her in a bed to wait. But for both Daenerys and Vlad, this was something solemn. For her, it was like a second wedding, but unlike the first, it was a union for love, a bond that would bind her to Vlad in life for all eternity. For Vlad, it was something similar, though more in tune with his vampiric nature. Marriages didn't mean much to a being who could live forever, but this giving your blood essence, a crystallization of your heart and power, to the woman you've chosen to spend eternity with, that was a real, tangible commitment. And he would do it gladly. The exterior of the room was guarded by his 5 blood riders, and the entire wall of Mirian was on high alert, reinforced by the best-trained freedmen and trusted soldiers of the Second Sons. Jorah Mormont and Ser Barristan were in the palace gardens with Miss Sandai, waiting. Vlad had informed them that he would be performing an important ritual with Daenerys, which might last 2 days or more. He explained that there was nothing to fear, but warned that if anything dared to interrupt it, he would reduce all of Mirian to ashes. No one believed his words were an exaggeration. Those under his command had come to know him, and they knew that Vlad never lied. If he made a promise, he kept it. That's why the Dothraki, the freedmen armies, the Second Sons, and the Unsullied were all on high alert. The 4 dragons circled above the pyramid at regular intervals, and the sentinels kept torches lit as an emergency signal. A total curfew had been declared. No one left after dark. Any suspicious person was arrested and executed without trial. No one knew exactly what was going on, but there were rumors among the people that someone had tried to attack the queen. That simple rumor was enough to make any pickpocket, thief, assassin, and opponent hide like rats or flee the city. For this reason, all armed groups under his command were active. The Dothraki patrolled the alleys and outer areas of the city in small mounted groups, the freedmen maintained order in the markets and civilian districts, the Unsullied sealed the palace entrances, and the Second Sons controlled the main gates, ready to shut or evacuate as needed. Even some trusted spies infiltrated the population to prevent disturbances or identify saboteurs. No one in Essos wanted to awaken the wrath of the Impaler. Not after what happened with Krasnus Emo Naklas, whose body still hung in Mirian's square, impaled on a cross forged by Vlad and kept conscious through blood magic, suffering endless torment. While the city remained in an uproar, the subterranean room was warm and calm, even silent. Daenerys Stormborn, of House Targaryen, observed the room's decoration. Banners of her house and Vlad's hung on the walls, excellently lit by oil lamps and candles, making the space feel welcoming rather than ominous. In the center of the room, there was only a red velvet chaise longue where Daenerys could recline, and a table with a chalice made of carved quartz crystals. "Are you ready, my love?" asked Vlad, gently caressing her face. "Will it hurt?" asked Daenerys, uncertainty in her voice. Vlad had explained to her that to be reborn, she must first die. "It will be like falling asleep," he replied, caressing her tenderly. "And then I'll wake up again," she said, more as if trying to convince herself than as an affirmation. "I'm sure of it. But if not, I will go to the gates of death and tear you from its claws. Nothing in this world will separate you from me, I swear," Vlad said solemnly, his eyes fixed on hers. Daenerys closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. "I trust you." Vlad smiled, a tender gesture reserved only for her. Then, with precision and calm, he sank the claws of one finger into his own chest, right above his heart. A drop of scarlet blood emerged and floated toward the chalice. And then, the drop expanded. As if it contained an ocean, the blood grew, filling the cup to the brim, undulating and alive. Vlad held the vessel delicately and offered it to her. "Everything I have been and everything I am is here," he pointed, looking at the blood in the cup. "And now, like my heart, it belongs to you." Daenerys didn't know what to say. She simply looked at him with all the love she felt for him and drank in one gulp. To her surprise, the blood didn't taste bitter or unpleasant. It was like water, fluid and clean. She placed the cup on the table and, without thinking, kissed Vlad. A soft kiss, so full of love that it was almost tender. He took her hand, helping her recline on the chaise longue, staying kneeling beside her, gently stroking her head. Daenerys felt an overwhelming need to sleep, and before closing her eyes, she whispered softly, "Forever." She didn't need to say more. Vlad responded to the whisper, though there was no need for him to say the "I love you" they both knew was there. "Forever," he replied, watching her fall asleep. Chapter 52, Awakening. Vlad had remained completely still for 2 days, staring at Daenerys, feeling how her insides were changing, how her heart gradually quickened as the blood transformed everything within her. He was happy, after all, who wouldn't be? He was going to be able to spend eternity with her. But when the process reached its final phase, when her heart began to beat slower and slower, until it stopped completely, Vlad felt something he thought he had forgotten. Fear. A primitive, icy terror coursed through his veins like an electric current. Panic that made his skin crawl and clouded his reasoning. He wanted to scream, curse, shake her awake, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew she would return. He had that certainty, and yet, the 48 hours he waited by her side, completely still, felt like a very twisted personal hell. He tried to calm himself, but his mind spun in circles, trapped in fictional scenarios, absurd explanations, desperate theories. All with the same axis, the possibility that Daenerys would not awaken. And then, after exactly 2 days since she drank his blood, her body began to react. First, her skin became paler, flawless, as if light itself caressed it. Her hair, already beautiful, became even silkier, like strands of silver. Her arms, slightly thin from years of deprivation in her childhood, gained firmness and harmony. Her hips subtly widened, her abdomen became firm and strong, and her breasts took on a fuller, more alive shape. Daenerys had already been a beautiful woman, but life on the streets, the constant struggle, had left invisible marks. Now, the embrace had erased each of them, revealing what had always been there, latent, the perfect shape of feminine beauty. If her beauty was known in the world before, now it would be enough to start wars. With each transformation, Vlad calmed down little by little, but he did not move. He refused to do so, as if looking away for even a second could make her disappear. And then, after what felt like an eternity, Daenerys' eyelids moved. As if the world had held its breath and finally let it go, she opened her eyes. The world was new. She didn't recognize it at first. Everything was too sharp, too vibrant. The texture of the air, every particle traveling with the currents, the way the light caressed the surfaces, the distant heartbeats of human hearts in the gardens, the whisper of the wind between the banners. Everything came to her at once, in waves that didn't overwhelm her, but intertwined like a perfect symphony. She could separate them, disconnect them, weave them together, as much as she wanted. Her eyes, though still a deep violet, now shone with an unusual clarity, as if sculpted from liquid amethyst, vibrating like gems. There was a nearly magical glow in them, a hypnotic shine. More beautiful, more alive. She blinked, and the flames of the candles danced in slow motion for her. She tilted her head slightly, and she could count the individual threads of the velvet chaise, distinguish the subtlest perfume of rose oil in the air, every crack in the stone walls. And then she saw him. "Vlad," she whispered, but her voice had changed. It was clearer, deeper, like a soft, beautiful melody. Vlad, kneeling at her side, motionless, with a devotion of stone. His eyes were pools of golden fire, and for the first time, she didn't see him as a man, but as what he truly was. She had been blind until that moment. Vlad had always seemed handsome, perfect to her, but even so, she hadn't been able to see the magnitude of what he was. Her poor human sight couldn't capture the perfection that made him up, how each muscle of his imposing chest tensed as he breathed, how his eyes glowed with a beautiful golden light like the dawn, how his lips were now more tempting than ever. She had been blind, but now she saw. So, she moved to kiss him. But unknowingly, she moved faster than she ever had before, faster than her human body had ever allowed. The chaise flew across the room and crashed hard into the wall, breaking into splinters. Daenerys collided with Vlad's body, and for the first time since she met him, he staggered backward. She was shocked. She had seen Vlad resist assaults from men, horses, and even dragons, without moving an inch. But now, she had made him retreat. "Be careful, my love," he said, laughing. "Now it's your turn to measure your strength." "What? How?" Daenerys was stunned. "Gods, I feel amazing. I've never felt so strong, so alive." "You're euphoric. You just need to calm down a bit and control your impulses. You'll regain your human sensitivity when your mind adapts to the new sensations." "My gods. I feel like I could lift a ship with my hands." She laughed with enthusiasm. "And you could. Now you have the strength for that and more. But first, you need to drink." With those words, Daenerys felt for the first time a burning sensation in her throat. A thirst like never before in her life, not even when she wandered through the desert. "Now, my love, drink," Vlad said as he exposed his shoulder blade, offering himself. "What? No. You already gave me your blood before. You're weak." She shook her head, alarmed. "Weak? Me?" Vlad laughed. "This is part of the process, my love. Now you will drink my blood, and I will drink yours. And then we will be one blood, united for all eternity." Daenerys hesitated for a moment, but she could see it clearly. Vlad showed no signs of weakness or fatigue. On the contrary, his bearing was as imposing as always, perhaps more so. And the thirst burned in her throat like a primal fire, impossible to ignore. Chapter 53, Liquid Ecstasy. She had tasted the finest wines of Essos, the thick beer of the north, the mead from the Dornish markets. She had known ecstasy in her husband's arms, had melted into pleasure for entire nights, believing herself in heaven, dying to reach the next climax. But how wrong she had been. The taste of Vlad's blood on her tongue was like the very essence of the wildest, most unrestrained night of passion distilled into a dark, exquisite wine, served only for her. She felt the intoxicating essence of her husband fill her lips, and thought she might faint from pure pleasure. And when she heard Vlad let out a deep, hungry growl as he pulled her small body toward him, gripping her hips with desire, she felt her consciousness teeter at the edge of the abyss. They writhed together for a few seconds, caught in a whirlwind of pleasure, until Daenerys, with great effort, pulled back just slightly, locking eyes with him as he stared back, both of their faces flushed and filled with lust. Then, knowing what was to come, she tore off the white dress she wore in a single motion, revealing her slender figure and offering her bare shoulder blade to her husband. For the first time, Vlad did not take her with tenderness, he sank his fangs into her skin with unrestrained hunger. And Daenerys, far from feeling pain, felt her legs give way beneath the most explosive, earth-shattering orgasm she had ever experienced. A loud, deep, sensual moan escaped her lips, spurring Vlad on even more, who lifted her as if she weighed nothing and slammed her against the wall with such force that the stone trembled and cracked from the impact. She felt her husband invade her, even as her blood filled her own lips. What came after turned into a haze of untamed desire, two naked bodies intertwined in a wild, almost feral dance that resembled a fight between predators more than an act of love. Daenerys moaned with such intensity it would have made even the most seasoned Lysani courtesan blush, and Vlad growled like a rabid wolf, unleashed, as they alternated between the pleasures of the flesh and the ecstasy of blood, in the longest, most feral and visceral session of passion they had ever shared. Outside the underground chamber, Mirian remained on alert. No one knew why, but the city had stayed eerily calm despite the presence of soldiers. In the outer gardens, Jorah, Barristan, and Missandei spoke, visibly concerned about the supposed ritual Vlad was performing. Missandei had spent the past few days trying to soothe the two men. As one of the closest people to the couple, she knew Vlad would never do anything to endanger Daenerys, but even she was beginning to worry. Suddenly, she felt a tremor in the ground, as if someone had struck the castle walls. A second later, another. Then another. The blows were strong and rhythmic. The treetops in the garden swayed, and the water in the fountain rippled. Everyone stood at once, alert. An attack? Asked Ser Barristan. No, it's not coming from outside the walls, Jorah replied, straining his ears. Then his eyes went wide, and he bolted toward the castle, shouting. It's coming from inside, he cried from the underground chamber. The other two followed him, along with several guards on duty. Jorah, Barristan, and the soldiers ran through the corridors, filled with uncertainty, expecting to find an attack or a battle, but instead found nothing. The only thing happening was that the blows became clearer the closer they got to the chamber. When they reached the doors, the Blood Riders blocked their path. Jorah Mormont, said Karan, leader of the Blood Riders, speaking with the polished courtesy gained from long service under Vlad. The king was clear. He is not to be disturbed. Do you plan to disobey? Are you insane? Ser Barristan exclaimed beside him. His Majesty is under attack. The Blood Riders all burst out laughing. Believe me, sir, that is not an attack, said Nork with a cheeky grin. Then what in the seven hells is? Barristan was cut off by the sudden increase in the rhythm of the pounding, which caused dust to fall from the ceiling, followed by a sensual, muffled moan, barely audible through the walls and distance. Everyone froze. Jorah turned red as a green boy, Barristan coughed awkwardly, and Missandei covered her mouth with both hands, blushing all the way to her ears. There's nothing to protect here, sir, said Laren, another Blood Rider, laughing. Best return to your posts. The soldiers looked at one another, some stifling chuckles. Jorah turned on his heels, flustered. Back to your posts, he ordered, avoiding eye contact with anyone. And, give their majesties some privacy. 2 more days passed before the mysterious tremors finally ceased within the Great Pyramid of Mirian. They were 2 days in which men and women in the castle found it hard to sleep, yet spent the time chuckling and sharing lewd comments as the rumors spread. Some even began to speculate that a small heir would emerge in the coming months. Missandei was no stranger to carnal pleasure, but she was stunned by the vigor not only of her king, but of her queen as well, who seemed capable of matching his pace. She was briefly concerned when Daenerys' handmaidens, Alyssa and Mera, were called to the underground chamber, but when they emerged minutes later, fully dressed, just a little dizzy and flushed, it became clear that her lord was just as devoted as he appeared. 2 days passed, and at last, the doors opened. Missandei waited with fresh clothes and blankets, but when she stepped inside, she found the chamber had been turned into a battlefield. The walls bore deep cracks, the floor was marked as if it had withstood a clash between titans, and the remains of the furniture lay scattered everywhere. Chapter 54, New Life. But what surprised her the most was seeing Daenerys. She had always been a beautiful woman, but now she looked like a goddess, almost ethereal. She moved with the coordination and grace of a dancer, and her voice now carried a musical quality, as if every word were part of a melody. And her eyes, still violet, now glowed with an almost hypnotic inner light, making it impossible for Missandei to look away. Her body was flawless, not a single scratch in sight, and she wore a satisfied smile as she wrapped herself in the Targaryen banner. Gods, thank you, Missandei. We forgot to bring a change of clothes, she said with a smile so radiant that Missandei felt her heart skip a beat. You look different, my lady, was all Missandei could say, averting her eyes as the queen dressed. Different how? Daenerys asked with genuine curiosity, and even her question sounded like music flowing. Vlad's deep voice emerged from beneath another banner bearing his own sigil. She's stunned by your breathtaking beauty, my queen, he said in a playful tone, pulling on a pair of pants while leaving his chest bare. You make the rest of the world look dull by comparison. Daenerys laughed with the carefree joy of a child, rolling her eyes. Don't listen to my husband, Missandei. Flattery is a cheap substitute for truth, she teased with a regal air. Vlad laughed heartily. Damn it, you know all my tricks, he said as he leaned in and gave her a passionate kiss. Missandei could only blush. The passion between the couple, who now looked like gods of beauty, left her dazed. How long were we gone in total, Missandei? Vlad asked, turning to her. 4 days in total, my king. Vlad clicked his tongue in mild annoyance. I suppose we should emerge, my love, or the realm might collapse without us. Daenerys kept laughing as she wrapped her arms around his chest, the gesture comical due to their difference in height. Heavy lies the head that wears the crown, she quipped, repeating her own joke. Vlad rolled his eyes and said, time to prepare for war. Daenerys smiled beautifully. We'll make them pay, she said darkly, but to Vlad, it only made her look even sexier. Thus, the days passed pleasantly for Vlad. Truth be told, the bonding ritual had weakened him, but only in terms of his status as a progenitor vampire. For any human or regular vampire, he was still the strongest being alive, and he needed only a couple of weeks to recover. The best part was that he could use that time to prepare his fleet and men for war. Throughout his stay in Mirian, he had trained his troops in modern battle tactics, formations, trench building, guerrilla warfare. Notably, his army was well supplied thanks to the generosity of the cities in Slavers Bay. Every soldier had armor, a shield, a sword, and a spear. Vlad had personally ordered Valyrian steel armor to be forged for both himself and Daenerys. Thanks to the death of the warlocks of the House of the Undying in Karth, he had obtained the secrets to create this mythical metal, and now was a perfect time to put them into practice. The process wasn't difficult, the hardest part was obtaining real steel using the forges of the era before heat treating it with dragon fire. After melting it, it was tempered in a mixture treated with blood magic. The armor had been under construction since they arrived in Mirian and would only be finished right before Vlad's departure, which, in truth, was rather fast, considering they needed his constant help in forging it. Vlad had also commissioned a Valyrian steel sword for Daenerys. Since her transformation, her new nature allowed her to march into battle without fear, and he wasn't about to deprive her of such a pleasure. As for Daenerys' new nature, the situation was complicated. As a newly turned vampire, she was still overwhelmed by her new impulses, but, interestingly, she hadn't killed anyone yet. Vlad attributed it to her inherently kind and compassionate nature. What she did struggle to control, however, was her desire to be with him. Now that she no longer tired, Vlad had to constantly remind her they had to leave the bedroom. If he didn't, they might spend weeks doing nothing but hours and hours of sex. Vlad eventually got her to channel all that energy into her new hobby, training with the sword. Ser Barristan and Jorah had initially objected, but after seeing the effects of the ritual, they set aside most of their concerns. Daenerys now moved with the grace and coordination of a trained dancer. She was fast and strong. Vlad asked her to keep her feats within human limits, or it would create problems. He wanted to delay the annoyance of people seeing them as gods at least for a few centuries, so keeping their strength at human levels would help. But even while staying within human scale, her new coordination, reflexes, and agility made her quite a competent warrior. If she had been taller than 5 feet 7 inches, she might have been even more intimidating. Ser Barristan praised her constantly for her quick learning and talent. Vlad invented a lie about having awakened the magic in her Targaryen blood, which let him avoid explaining things in detail. The ever-reliable a sorcerer did it never failed. Preparing their departure from Mirian wasn't without setbacks. The Sons of the Harpy, those pesky liberators, came out of their holes to cause trouble, killing several unsullied patrols before they could be tracked down. Vlad wanted to leave the matter to Daenerys. It was a good way for her to let loose for a while and kill for the first time. So, he put her in command of his blood riders, and in less than 5 days, the Sons of the Harpy and all their sympathizers were tied to stakes, impaled in Mirian's main square. As much as Vlad would have liked to witness an impalement himself, this was Daenerys' moment. Chapter 55, Mother of the Dragon. Daenerys was known as Missa, the merciful mother, the liberator of the slaves of Mirian. She had torn off their chains, given them bread and dignified work, and rescued them from the cruelty of their masters. An invaluable reputation for a ruler, but in moments like this, it was also a burden. And that day, she was determined to cast it off. She rose in the center of the scaffold, standing tall on the raised platform in the square, clad in dark Valyrian steel armor. The scales of the metal interlocked like those of a dragon, and behind her, a blood-red cloak billowed, bearing the emblem of her house. Behind her, Vlad, wearing matching armor, sat on one of the 2 stone thrones. Barristan, Missandei, and the guards, led by Grey Worm, flanked the structure alongside the Blood Riders, now dressed in their barbaric armor. Daenerys looked out over the crowd packed into the square, surrounding the captured masters, barely contained by the line of Unsullied. Then, she raised her voice so that all could hear. "People of Mirian?" she cried out, her voice firm and beautiful, rising above the clamor. "I stand before you, people of free men, as your queen and protector. You all know that my husband and I are foreigners, that we were not born or raised among you. And yet, when we saw your suffering, we knew we could not stand idly by." She let her words settle. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, followed by shouts of praise. And yet, there were those who opposed us. Those who saw all the good we did by freeing men, women, and children, and felt nothing but rage. Not for justice, not for love of their city, but because they lost their gold coins and their power. She turned to the chained masters and pointed a finger at them. The square erupted in boos. The faces of former slaves reflected a mixture of fury and hope. "Despite all my mercy, all the concessions I offered them," she continued, her tone bitter and her expression grim. "Despite allowing them to keep their power and their wealth, they could not accept it. Even when they saw that hiring free men could be cheaper than enslaving them, still, they could not do it. Do you know why?" No one answered. Daenerys paused, letting the silence speak for her. "Because these men do not love wealth, nor do they value comfort. What they cherish, what they long for, is cruelty. They take pleasure in seeing good men and women chained like animals, beaten, starved, broken. They do not want you for your worth. They want you because your pain makes them feel powerful." The crowd burst into shouts, furious and impassioned. Many raised their fists. Some cried. Others simply stared at Daenerys, as if someone had finally put into words what they had suffered in silence for years. She raised a hand, asking for silence. Her face was solemn, her gaze burned like dragon fire. "That is what we fight against. Not just chains and shackles, not just walls and whips, we fight a poison that lives in the hearts of cruel and greedy men. Today, we tear it out by the root. These men, known as the Sons of the Harpy, conspired to overthrow you from the throne of Mirian, because in their eyes, they had the right to trample your bodies for their pleasure, to chain and kill you without remorse, simply for their own satisfaction." She took a few steps toward the masters, her eyes fixed on them like blades. "And that is why, today, the people will witness the fate of all who seek to place chains upon men. You those who suffered, who wept, who buried children, fathers, and mothers, you have the final word. There will be no more masters in Mirian." She turned again to the crowd, her voice rising like a flame. The crowd responded with a single cry, a human roar that made the city walls tremble. "Missa." The dragons roared from atop the Great Pyramid, as if celebrating with their mother, growing closer as they heard her call. For several months, the four beasts had done little more than eat and rest, growing relentlessly. Now, they were as large as elephants, strong enough to carry their riders with ease. They descended from the sky with a deafening roar that chilled the blood of every noble of Mirian present in the square, condemned or not. Kinvara, leader of the Red Faith, who had practically moved her seat to Mirian, raised her hands to the heavens, praying and praising what she considered the living embodiment of the fire of Azor. The dragons landed with a crash that shook the very stones of the city and spread their majestic wings as if to show the world their glory. But what happened next left all present breathless except the king and queen. Drakal, the largest of the dragons, bowed his horn-crowned head toward Vlad, and spoke. From his steaming jaws came a guttural sound, rough as lava flowing over stone, but unmistakable in meaning in High Valyrian. "Kapa, Kapa, father." A hush fell over the square. The crowd's eyes widened in disbelief. But it was no mistake, no illusion, because, moments later, Drakal turned his burning gaze toward Daenerys and, with the same effort, uttered another word. "Munia, Muna, mother." The crowd erupted in cries of praise. Kinvara and the faithful of the Red Faith fell to their knees in tears, while Mirian's nobles turned pale, some swaying as if about to faint. The dragons, creatures more powerful than any other on the planet, symbols of power and the gods themselves, now bowed before their kings. Daenerys watched the crowd's reaction in silence, her eyes gleaming with determination as the dragons, still encircling her, roared fiercely. Then she raised her hand, and at once, silence fell over the plaza. Chapter 56, Execution. Daenerys watched the crowd's reaction in silence, her eyes gleaming with determination as the dragons, still circling her, roared with force. Then, she raised her hand, and silence immediately fell over the square. "Those who conspired in the sewers," she said firmly, her voice rising above the murmurs, "those who joined the Sons of the Harpy to steal the freedom of the people, deserve neither mercy nor compassion. They, who chose cruelty, who used fear and oppression as tools of power, will die today." With every word, the tension grew. The captured nobles trembled with fear. "Today," she continued, her gaze cold as it swept over the nobles, a chilling contrast to the beauty of her face, "I shall take your lives, as I have done with so many others before you." Some of the nobles, already on their knees, tried to plead, but Daenerys turned her back on them. Their fate had already been decided. They understood the significance of what was about to happen. "My children," she murmured with a maternal softness as she stroked the scaled necks of Rhaegal and Drakal. "Dracarys." A deafening roar burst from the dragons. Drakal, the largest of them all, was the first to spread his wings and unleash a cry, his shadow casting darkness over the plaza. At his side, the other three dragons followed, roaring and opening their jaws. The air quickly grew hot, and a burning breeze began to swirl around those present. Vlad, standing beside her, watched the scene with a calm yet dangerous gaze. Fire was the fitting punishment not just for these nobles, but for all who still believed they could defy the future he and Daenerys had worked so hard to build. And then, the dragons unleashed their fire. Pure, intense, voracious flames engulfed the nobles in a blinding explosion of heat and light. Screams were drowned out by the roar of fire, which consumed their bodies and turned their souls into smoke. The spectators, both terrified and mesmerized, could not look away. The spectacle was overwhelming. When the fire finally faded, only ashes remained. The cruelties these men had wrought no longer had shape. Only a lesson that would be etched in the memory of all who witnessed it. Daenerys slowly turned to the crowd, her face serene, but her eyes shone with intensity. This is the fate of those who choose to place chains upon others, she declared with a voice that echoed like a call for justice. Those who seek oppression will find only fire and blood. The response was immediate. The Unsullied struck the ground with their spears, the Dothraki let out war cries, the freedmen cheered, and the dragons roared into the sky. Vlad, from his position beside the thrones, observed the woman who had emerged from the vulnerable girl he had rescued from her brother's clutches. And for the first time in a long while, he smiled with genuine pride. In the days that followed the execution, Vlad immersed himself in preparations for his departure. Westeros was not his immediate destination, but rather the solution to a more pressing problem: ships. The true obstacle to war wasn't numbers. His armies already boasted more than 150,000 men. The problem was transporting them. In theory, he had a fleet larger than those of Lannisport or the Iron Islands, a force to be reckoned with at sea. But in practice, his ships, generously acquired in Slavers Bay and Karth, were insufficient. He had 150 warships, designed to carry 100 soldiers each, but they could barely transport 80 with all the necessary supplies. His other 15 merchant ships, capable of holding 200 people, were also not enough. Even stretched to the limit, he could only move 15,000 men in a single trip, which was nearly laughable if he planned to conquer Westeros. So, he would travel to Braavos to negotiate, to buy, or to take whatever was necessary. 200 additional merchant vessels would suffice. Meanwhile, Daenerys would go with a small diplomatic retinue to Dorne, to discover whether House Martell would support the last Targaryen in her claim for the Iron Throne. If the negotiations went as he hoped, the fleet of Dorne combined with that of Braavos would be enough to transport more than 60,000 men in 1 or 2 voyages. But before setting out, he needed to thoroughly inspect his entire army. First came the fleet. He gathered his best captains and personally oversaw the inspection of each of the 100 warships and 15 merchant vessels. Any loose plank, torn sail, or weakened anchor was replaced without delay. The shipyards worked day and night, hammers and saws ringing like war drums. The dragons flew over the harbor every sunset, practicing formation flight with their mother, determined to ensure they could not be struck by any arrow, as if the Valyrian steel protections Vlad had forged were not enough. Vlad walked among the docks, inspecting stores of grain, water, wine, and oil, ensuring each container was sealed and each load properly secured. There would be no hunger or disease among his ranks. Then came the organization of the army. The Dothraki riders were divided into smaller legions, each led by one of his blood riders, ready to move swiftly once they reached land. The horses and men, now armored, had turned the Dothraki into the most fearsome and effective cavalry ever seen. The Unsullied, disciplined as always, were arranged into companies designed to assault cities, streets, and narrow passages, using overlapping shield formations adapted for slow but highly effective movement. Their armor was also changed and improved, shields forged from the finest steel and leather breastplates crafted for durability and lightness. Vlad appointed commanders who spoke the common tongue, men loyal to him, many of them raised by his own hand since the fall of Astapor. The freedmen and mercenaries were organized into mixed squads, reinforced by spearmen from Astapor and crossbowmen from Yunkai. Chapter 57, War Preparations. Each ship would carry a balanced mix of units, designated commanders, and a scribe responsible for keeping records of the equipment, provisions, and number of men on board, along with a full squad of medical teams, the best this era had to offer, brought directly from Volantis. But all this machinery would only make sense if the plan was clear, and Vlad had already designed it with meticulous precision. One day, amidst all his planning, he gathered all his generals, trusted men, the progeny he had left in charge of the city, and his most loyal captains. They were not few, but Vlad had ensured their absolute obedience through his compulsion. While not a subtle ability, it was more than enough to detect if there were spies among his inner circle. Daenerys stood by his side, gently caressing his forearm as his men entered his office. The office was filled with bookshelves, holding various types of books. In the center, a solid wooden table took up most of the space, and in front of the window sat a wooden desk where many documents lay, along with candles and inkwells. The central table was large enough for everyone to gather around without issue, and in the middle, a basic map of Westeros was spread out, with several reports distributed among his generals. Ser Barristan and Missandei stood beside Daenerys, as always, while Jorah Mormont entered alongside Grey Worm. Despite having confessed his betrayal ahead of time, Daenerys had not fully forgiven him, so she kept him out of her inner circle. Gentlemen greeted Vlad. Daenerys cleared her throat with amused reproach. And lovely ladies, Vlad corrected himself with a smile. It is time to plan our return to Westeros, he announced solemnly. Everyone nodded. The few men from Westeros smiled, eager to finally return to their homeland. The generals also showed satisfaction, albeit for different reasons. They saw in this war an opportunity to gain glory and titles. Even the 5 progeny Vlad had created to control Mirian wore calculating smiles, anticipating how their power would grow once he departed. Daenerys, more beautiful than ever under her new vampiric nature, had a radiant and predatory smile that only emphasized her ethereal beauty. I will depart for Bravos in 5 days. I'll negotiate with the Sea Lord to secure at least 150 ships. That will be enough to transport our troops to Westeros and establish a stable base of operations. Then, Daenerys will travel to Dorne in secret and meet with Doran Martell. If his family remains loyal to the Targaryen cause, we'll strike a deal that will grant us additional ships to complement those from Bravos, allowing us to transport even more men. I intend to land in Westeros with 50,000 soldiers, he declared, casting a meaningful glance at Daenerys. The mission in Dorne was, in theory, relatively simple. He had given Daenerys free rein to negotiate as she saw fit, trusting in her charisma and lineage. The only non-negotiable part was to secure, and take as a guest, Myrcella Baratheon. He moved a few wooden figures to a specific spot on the map. Ser Barristan and Jorah were visibly surprised by the location. Lannisport, my lord? Jorah asked, unable to hide his curiosity. Are we not planning to reclaim King's Landing? Daenerys shot him a glare that could have fit him into an envelope. Are you questioning your king? She asked, venom in her voice. I wouldn't dare, my queen, but it's crucial that the generals are aware of the overall strategy, Jorah replied in a conciliatory tone. And you're right, Vlad interjected. He looked into Daenerys' eyes, silently asking her to control her temper. Her transition had made her noticeably more fiery. To answer your question, Ser Jorah, while taking King's Landing would be a moral blow to the enemy, it would be a strategic mistake. We would be isolated, with the Stormlands, the Vale, and Highgarden closing in on our flanks. Additionally, our fleet would be rendered useless once the enemy fortified the sea routes, and key ports like Lannisport and Oldtown will be well defended. He paused and pointed to Lannisport on the map. Lannisport, on the other hand, is vulnerable, with Tywin's forces focused on the capital. If we strike quickly, we can advance toward Casterly Rock, perhaps the only fortress capable of withstanding dragons. By taking it, we'll cut off the enemy's supply and retreat lines, destroying their reputation in the process. Then, the Black Fleet, the name for the war fleet, my wife and I will sail to Pike. Ser Barristan frowned and asked, do you plan to recruit the Ironborn, my lord? They are rapists and murderers, he spat bitterly. I plan to reduce the island of Pike to ashes, Vlad replied coldly. There were 2 things he despised above all else, child killers and rapists. The Ironborn were both. I will not allow them to strike from the rear. According to my spies, they have 70 warships ready to raid. I will reduce that number to 0 and burn their island and their people to the ground. No one objected, although some thought the punishment excessive. Vlad merely gave them a look before continuing. With 30,000 men, we will march on Highgarden. We'll take control of the kingdom's granary and cut off the enemy's food supply. My lord, Ser Barristan spoke cautiously, the Tyrells are allied with the Lannisters. Mace Tyrell plans to wed his daughter to Joffrey, and Highgarden can muster at least 50,000 men. You are correct, Ser Barristan, but I have reasons to believe the marriage between Margaery and Joffrey will not take place. And if I can assure Olenna Tyrell the safety and escape of her granddaughter in King's Landing, the Tyrells will join our cause, he noted, with a smile that vanished a second later. And if not, 30,000 men, plus 4 dragons, will make the Tyrells reconsider their loyalties. Everyone in the room, save for Daenerys, felt a chill run down their spine. Chapter 58, The Plan. Vlad continued explaining as his finger slid southward, toward the Citadel and Oldtown. After securing Highgarden, we'll land 15,000 men in Oldtown. While Daenerys and I fly with the dragons, we will destroy the Seat of the Faith after exposing their conspiracy against the Targaryens. In doing so, we'll take control of the Citadel, securing the center of knowledge on this continent. He then moved another ivory piece. Once our base is established, 40,000 more men will set sail from Mirian with golden dragons, supplies, and artillery. The Dothraki cavalry will control the roads, the Black Fleet, the seas. Then, Daenerys and I will personally visit the western houses to ensure their loyalty. Will those houses swear fealty to your grace? Asked Missandei. Or they will burn, Vlad concluded, curtly. The Westerlands were only valuable for their mines. He could eliminate all noble families and place loyal ones in their castles. This must be done within a year and a half from the next moon, gentlemen, Vlad declared. The council members looked at one another, surprised. My lord, that is very little time, observed Dario Naharis. I know. But everyone here knows the truth behind this war. Believe it or not, you all understand that we must unify Westeros quickly, while conserving our strength. His inner circle had already been told the truth. Beyond the wall, the White Walkers and their whites were advancing, recruiting warriors that felt no pain nor fatigue. It should be said that skepticism varied among them, but those who had served Vlad long enough had witnessed his magic and his power. They understood that, if the threat was as deadly as he claimed, Westeros had to unite, or it would fall, and Essos would follow. Vlad let his words settle before continuing. That's all for now, gentlemen. The rest we will plan in the field. We know plans never survive first contact with the enemy. We will not waste effort on strategies too far ahead. One by one, the attendees began to leave. Some in silence, others whispering to each other, but none dared question what they'd heard. Vlad remained by the map, unmoving, eyes fixed on the pieces as if he could still see the war playing out in his mind. Daenerys approached once everyone had gone. She walked without hurry, crossing her arms while watching him with one eyebrow slightly raised. Is something bothering you? Vlad let out a faint sigh, barely audible. He took a moment to respond, and when he did, his voice was lower than usual. I take no pleasure in bloodshed. It's not what I want, nor what should be necessary. But there's no alternative. This goes beyond a throne, Dany. You know that if it were up to me, I'd spend eternity with you in some distant castle. A warm smile lit his face. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she stepped closer and placed a hand over his chest, right above his heart, which no longer beat, just like hers. You're not alone in this anymore, she said simply. We'll do it together, no matter what comes. Vlad looked at her, serious, for a moment more, then his expression softened. He leaned in and kissed her, gently at first, then with more intensity, as if the moment itself gave him breath. Daenerys kissed him back the same way, her hand at the back of his neck, not letting go. No more words were needed. With just a look and a knowing smile, they left the room quickly and disappeared into the tower's corridors, to spend a warm night together. As always, the days passed swiftly. Vlad spent his time planning until the moment came to leave for Braavos on Dracul's back, now the size of a blue whale, large enough to swallow a grown man whole. The flight from Mirian was surprisingly quick, even by Vlad's standards. Dracul flew as if trying to impress him, gliding through the air currents with precision, using every draft to gain speed. Vlad rarely felt stress, but coordinating a war effort was one of those exceptions. Yet up there in the sky, he felt weightless, free. Dracul twisted through the air as if showing off, as if saying, "Look at me, father." His metallic armor clinked with every move, and the leather saddle was the only thing anchoring Vlad to the beast's back. As for the dragons, Vlad knew the ritual had connected them all in a special way. It was a kind of empathic bond. He and Daenerys could feel what the dragons felt, and vice versa. His magic had also made them grow faster, stronger, and smarter than any dragon that had ever existed, even before Valyria. Slowly, they had even begun to speak. Simple, short phrases but clear. Anyone who heard them would understand what they meant. When Braavos emerged on the horizon, Vlad merely watched it in silence. The city was a grey and damp sprawl, crossed by canals and shrouded in mist. The Titan of Braavos stood in the bay, but it paled before Dracul's shadow looming over the rooftops. The dragon did not go unnoticed. His roar echoed between the towers, unleashing chaos. The Braavasi were brave, but no courage could withstand such a creature. Had it been Daenerys arriving, they would have welcomed her with reverence. All of Essos knew and respected the benevolent mother of dragons. Her husband was another story. As soon as it became clear that the dragon rider was a man, the city fell into panic. Bells rang, sailors rushed to secure their ships, people pointed at the sky, screaming. A stampede of citizens tried to flee as far as they could from the Lord Impaler. Vlad's reputation had already become legend in the free cities, a sort of modern boogeyman. Merely mentioning his name was enough to make men, women, and children shiver. Upon seeing the chaos, Vlad could only smirk. That was precisely his goal, to be the demon under the beds of those who defied order, the only way to prepare the world for the long night. Comment. Chapter 59, Braavos. The landing was direct, without detours. Vlad guided Dracul to the Sea Lord's palace, a solid, fortified structure with dark roofs and statues that faced the sea. Dracul landed with force, shaking the ground and kicking up a cloud of dust. A few tiles fell, a nearby horse bolted, and the guards didn't know whether to run, scream, or freeze in place. Vlad dismounted from the dragon, letting himself fall from the height slowly and gently, like a leaf carried by the wind. It was a striking contrast to his figure, 6 feet 1 inch of broad shoulders and muscular arms, clad in dark Valyrian scale armor and a cloak red as blood. The scarlet witch sword hung from his waist, as eye-catching as he was. He took a few steps toward the entrance, unhurried, while Dracul settled behind him, lying down like a giant, peaceful hound. Likeri, Dracul. Umbagon Daer, he commanded in High Valyrian, stroking the scaly neck of the beast. The dragon responded with a purring sound, though due to its size, it came out more like a menacing growl. A platoon of soldiers crowded the entrance, trembling swords in hand. Vlad simply stood in front of the dragon, hands clasped behind his back, which only emphasized his commanding presence. He waited patiently for someone to invite him in. After all, he had come to negotiate, and he could be as polite as the situation demanded. Several tense minutes passed before, finally, from behind the soldiers, a man in dark clothing and a short cape emerged. He walked with a hurried, nervous pace, as if carrying a grenade in his hands. He stopped at a cautious distance, swallowing hard before offering a slight bow. My lord, he began, his voice barely a choked whisper. The Sea Lord wishes to know what you seek in Braavos. Vlad Dracul. The name, spoken aloud, seemed to tense every person present. The surrounding soldiers instinctively flinched, and one even dropped his spear. Vlad looked at him calmly, wearing a neutral and elegant expression. I seek only an audience, he replied in a deep voice. A proposal I am sure the Sea Lord will wish to hear. The envoy shuddered at his courteous tone, as if the contrast only made him more terrifying. He nodded immediately, unsure how to proceed. Why, you may enter, my lord, he stammered, bowing clumsily. Please, this way. The gates creaked open slowly. Vlad walked without hurry, his cloak billowing behind him, as striking as it was elegant. Dracul did not move from his spot, but his eyes remained fixed on the entrance, watching every tiny soldier left behind to keep an eye on him. As Vlad moved through the palace halls, the soldiers standing along the side stepped back. Courtiers fled to other rooms, and even the boldest servants found excuses to disappear through side doors. The silence was nearly absolute, only Vlad's footsteps and those of the escort echoed through the palace. Vlad smiled inwardly. This was precisely the reaction he had sought ever since he began impaling people. Not out of vanity, but pragmatism. What soldier would march to war against the dreaded Lord Impaler? At last, the great doors of the Sea Lord's chamber swung open. The interior revealed a long, dark hall lit by candles and adorned with Bravacy banners. At the far end, the Sea Lord sat on a throne of black stone, flanked by several high-ranking nobles. At his side stood the first sword of Bravus, a man clad in full armor, bearing the expression of one marching to war, with one hand firmly resting on the hilt of his curved blade. Several guards stood in formation around the chamber, discreetly surrounding Vlad. The atmosphere was heavy, thick with tension. The Sea Lord, an older man with a neatly trimmed grey beard, tried to maintain his dignity, but couldn't help his fingers drumming anxiously on the armrest of the throne. The surrounding nobles avoided meeting Vlad's gaze. Vlad stopped a few paces from the center of the hall and lifted his gaze calmly, taking in every corner, every trembling face. "Greetings, Sea Lord," he said with a slight bow, without losing a shred of his imposing presence. "I am Vlad Drakul. I come to propose an agreement to Bravus." Despite Vlad's respectful and elegant tone, a chill swept over everyone present. As if, despite his words, the deal would cost them the lives of their firstborn. The Sea Lord took a deep breath, trying to control the tremor in his hands before slowly rising to his feet. When he finally spoke, his voice was sharp and tense, everything contrary to the image of courage he wished to project. "Bravus is not a city accustomed to dragons on its rooftops, Lord Drakul," he said, lifting his chin slightly with a forced air of dignity. "The sight of such a creature has caused panic. Some would see this as a threat." His words were followed by a dense silence. One of the nobles swallowed hard. The first sword, however, never took his eyes off Vlad, fully alert for any movement. Vlad maintained his serene posture, hands clasped behind his back, without the slightest sign of hostility. His gaze rested briefly on the Sea Lord, then swept the hall before speaking in a calm voice, modulated like a well-bred noble educating one of his duller servants. "Dragon lords travel with their dragons, Sea Lord," he said gently. "It would have been unthinkable for Aegon the Conqueror to ask for permission before landing in any of the—" he paused, as if choosing his words carefully, "noble free cities. It is assumed to be an honor to receive a dragon lord." The comparison sent a shiver through several in the room. The name Aegon still carried weight, and the suggestion that Vlad considered himself his equal did not go unnoticed. However, his tone wasn't arrogant. It was a simple statement, as if explaining why the sun rises in the east. Chapter 60, Lord of the Sea. The Sea Lord pressed his lips together, visibly frustrated, but before he could reply, one of the nobles, a middle-aged man in a purple doublet adorned with pearls, stepped forward, raising a hand impatiently. "Lord Drakul, please, I beg you, get to the point," he said with a nervous but clear voice. "Why have you come to our city?" Another noble murmured in agreement, and a third one nodded. No one wished to prolong the presence of the Lord Impaler in the palace longer than necessary. Vlad raised an eyebrow, amused by their reaction. "Very well. Let us speak plainly," he said at last, in a tone that was almost theatrical. "I have come to Bravus to negotiate. I wish to hire part of your merchant fleet." His words, though clear, left several of them puzzled. "If Lord Drakul wishes for Bravus to offer its services for transporting something, we shall gladly make the proper arrangements," announced the Sea Lord, visibly more composed. "Not what, but whom," Vlad corrected. "I want to rent part of Bravus's fleet to transport my army to King's Landing. Shall we say, 300 ships?" Those present paled. Every ruler in Essos knew the size of Vlad's army, more than 100,000 men, all ready to fight and die for the pair known as the Breakers of Chains. "That is inconceivable," protested a noble, clearly alarmed. "Bravus will not take sides in the wars of foreign kings." "I'm not asking you to take sides." Vlad raised a hand calmly. "I have my own war fleet, enough to secure the passage. I only wish to use your merchant ships. I need transport for men, weapons, provisions. Nothing more." The nobles leaned in slightly. Even the Sea Lord stopped drumming his fingers. The agreement Vlad proposed was more than feasible. Besides, there was precedent, obviously not on such a scale, but Bravus had lent its ships to transport troops more than once to those who could pay their price. The real question was whether Vlad would pay that price. 300 ships would paralyze maritime trade, objected the Sea Lord. "The city cannot afford such a diversion of resources." Vlad nodded, as if he had expected that. 200 then. For 4 months, no more. There was a moment of low discussion. The Sea Lord whispered with his advisors and consulted documents. At last, he looked up. "It might be possible, but every transaction requires payment. What do you offer in return, Lord Drakul?" That was the heart of the matter. The Sea Lord feared Vlad would demand their fleet without offering anything of true value. After all, letting them live was a decent argument in a negotiation. In such case, Bravus would accept, but at least the Sea Lord would know that reasoning with Vlad Drakul was not an option. But Vlad was no foolish tyrant seeking enemies for trivial reasons. He usually paid in kind, but he also kept his word. 200,000 gold dragons, paid by my family within no more than a month. And a non-aggression pact with Bravus for 15 years. Neither my armies nor my allies will attack your routes, cities, or interests, whether in Westeros or Essos. The effect was immediate. Even the most skeptical leaned forward. The gold was welcome, but the true treasure was the promise of peace. And if Braavos is attacked by others? Asked the Sea Lord in an inquisitive tone. You will receive military support. Within reason, Vlad replied with a slight shrug. I don't send dragons for mere raids, but if a nation declares war on you, you may count on my family's aid. Little by little, it seemed the fear Vlad inspired was beginning to be eclipsed by the benefits of allying with him. After all, despite his infamous reputation, there were no tales of him slaughtering innocents without cause. The agreement was sealed swiftly, without any inconvenience. Several nobles present displayed an almost excessive interest in Vlad's war plans, but he remained deliberately vague, refusing to reveal important details. He only mentioned aloud that his objective was to attack King's Landing in 2 months. That unfortunate slip of information was, of course, a deception. Vlad knew that the Lannisters, Littlefinger, and the Spider had spies everywhere, and with Braavos being such an important port, it was obvious that news of his military preparations would spread quickly. He was counting on it. And in truth, it served his plans. He doubted Tywin Lannister would fall for such an obvious stratagem, but it was often easier to deceive an intelligent man than a complete fool, so it remained to be seen. As for the situation in King's Landing, truthfully, he cared little about the changes to the history he knew. At this point, he had most of the bases covered for when the long night finally began. However, Joffrey's death was still something he needed to ensure. He wasn't entirely convinced that, given the current situation, Olenna Tyrell would go ahead with her plan to poison the bastard, but it didn't matter. He intended to be present at that feast, and if the little plague didn't die, he would handle it himself. Some might wonder why not simply kill him directly, with brutality and without pretense. Vlad, of course, had considered the idea, but the fact was he didn't plan to rule the entirety of Westeros by himself. He would need loyal and trustworthy lords, not ones controlled by magic, but by oaths. And, unfortunately, the Lannister bastards, Tommen and Myrcella, though illegitimate, were still Baratheons on paper. With Renly dead and Stannis as prone to surrender as Ned Stark, he would need Storm's End to be occupied by a more docile Baratheon. Tommen was the best candidate. As for Casterly Rock, Vlad could name Tyrion or Jaime as heir, if they survived, or even have them legally adopt Myrcella, evidently after the tragic death of his mother, making her the de facto heir. It didn't truly matter which option he chose, but it would be foolish not to take advantage of such convenient levers of control, especially if they prevented unnecessary deaths. And he doubted the 2 children, easily influenced and still innocent, would ever ally with someone who, hypothetically, had brutally murdered their brother. No matter how much of a psychopath he had been. Chapter 61, Practice. After the meeting with the Sea Lord, Vlad did not depart from Braavos immediately, much to the dismay of the nobles. Instead, he made his way calmly to the Iron Bank. It was a good time to check in on his own offspring within the institution, and ensure that his takeover was sailing smoothly. Belcaro received him without fanfare, following the usual protocol of the Iron Bank. The institution was not prone to pampering the egos of nobles. Why should they? They were, practically, the most powerful entity in Braavos. But Vlad couldn't have cared less. Protocol was something one learned to despise over time, and he much preferred being spoken to like a tavern boy rather than a king. Belcaro was adapting to immortality surprisingly well. He had served Vlad for years and had risen quickly through the bank's ranks. He was only a couple of years away from becoming one of its directors. And when that happened, Vlad would control half the money flowing across both continents. One detail he particularly appreciated was that Belcaro had finally secured a real dragon egg, after years of searching. Why had it taken so long? Well, truthfully, authentic dragon eggs were extremely rare. Most of those circulating on the market came from the time of the Dance of the Dragons, relics lost amid conflicts, plunder, or tragedy. He was sure Daenerys would appreciate a younger, small, and scaly child. After the meeting, Vlad had left Braavos on Dracul's back, but had actually sent him flying alone to search for his mother's ship, as he could feel where it was. He, on the other hand, slipped back into Braavos under cover of night, moving easily through the city's long alleys, searching for the address Belcaro had provided. Vlad had requested a safe house with a basement. He wanted to test his method of long-distance travel using fire as a medium. It was experimental magic, not particularly dangerous, but certainly eye-catching, so he preferred privacy. When he found the house, he entered quickly and alerted his offspring gathered in King's Landing to find a discreet spot and light a fire, then pour their own blood into it, acting as a beacon. Vlad didn't need long incantations or prayers to any god. He simply focused on the power of pyromancy flowing through his body and visualized the effect he wished to achieve. His body ignited in flames, as if his very flesh fused with them, his eyes blazed as if he were a demon, his hair merged with the fire, waving like a wildfire, and just as the flames threatened to consume the basement completely, he vanished. Northern coast of Lys. The Red Lady sailed peacefully along the northern coast of Lys. The enormous merchant ship, practically brand new, had clean, polished wood with smooth finishes. It was one of Vlad's most recent vessels, and although it appeared to be transporting fabrics and spices, its true cargo could not have been more precious to him. Daenerys was in one of the cabins, wearing an elegant Dornish silk dress that clung softly to her figure. The most curious thing was her posture. She was sitting cross-legged in a meditative position, one hand extended forward. Her brow was furrowed, her jaw slightly clenched, as if solving an especially complex math problem. In the center of her palm floated a small sphere of fire, no larger than a marble. It danced with a timid orange light, flickering weakly as Daenerys tried to keep it stable. Sometimes it spun slowly, other times it trembled and extinguished completely. She sighed each time that happened, but didn't give up. Since Vlad had turned her, her affinity with magic had intensified. She was more sensitive to power, felt it running over her skin like a warm whisper. And yet, she couldn't quite master it. It's better than yesterday, Missandei commented with a kind smile, not looking up from the thick book in her hands. It was the same volume Vlad had given her before setting sail, a compendium on the principles of pyromancy, filled with personal notes in the margins. Some passages were poetic, others completely cryptic. Some even seemed written in another language. Missandei had decided to read it with her, helping interpret the more abstract parts. Better isn't good enough, Daenerys murmured, closing her fingers to extinguish the sphere with a soft hiss. If I'm going to face enemies who master magic, I need more than a playful spark in my palm. Missandei closed the book carefully, looking at her calmly. Taming a dragon isn't as easy as casting a spell. Vlad told you this would take time. And time is the one thing I don't have, she replied, though her voice sounded somewhat bitter. The journey had been long, more than a week sailing along the coasts of the Narrow Sea instead of flying over them. But there was a reason for it. The meeting with Prince Doran had been arranged in secret, so she couldn't appear riding Balerion over the skies of Sunspear. If she did, the news would reach King's Landing before the day was over. Too much spectacle ruined diplomacy. That's why the Black Dragon had flown alone to a deserted island in the Stepstones. He would wait there until she finished her meeting with the Lord of Sunspear. After that, the return would be swift, a flight of a few hours to Mirian, where the war preparations were nearly complete. Daenerys rose gracefully, stretching her legs and walking to the cabin's window. The sea was calm. Voyages from Essos to Sunspear were usually smooth, very scenic. When I arrive, we'll see if the Martells still consider me family, she said quietly, almost to herself. Though I doubt it. Doran is intelligent, and he won't trust easily. Missandei stepped forward, gently placing a cloak over her shoulders. And the princess? Arianne, she's the heir, isn't she? Wouldn't it be easier to win her over? The queen rolled her eyes with a slight huff. If it were Vlad, maybe. Reports say she's impatient, impulsive, and quite lustful. I think that's why Doran still hasn't announced whether she'll inherit or not when he dies. Daenerys kept her gaze on the horizon for a few more seconds. The sea was calm, too calm for her liking. She had spent much of the trip without any trouble, which once would have been a relief. But now, it only gave her more time to think. I hope my stay in Sunspear isn't too problematic, she said casually, turning to Missandei. It'd be nice if, just this once, everything went according to plan. Missandei gave her a small smile, saying nothing. Both of them knew that almost never happened. She passed her hand over the table and reopened the book, carefully flipping through it until reaching a section she had marked earlier. Let's try again, she said finally, extending her hand forward once more. This time I want to hold it for more than a minute. Missandei sat beside her again, ready to correct, read, or simply observe in silence. The fire sphere reappeared in Daenerys' palm, lively and stubborn like its owner. Try not to burn anything, Missandei said playfully. Again. Daenerys let out a small laugh, not taking her eyes off the sphere. Relax, it only happened a couple of times. And with that, the cabin filled with the soft orange glow of the flame, while the Red Lady continued its course toward the distant south. Chapter 62, Playing with Fire. Meanwhile, in Sunspear, Doran Martell sat in his study, once again contemplating the letter that had been delivered to him several weeks earlier. The letter bore a red ink seal, written on high-quality parchment, with clear letters traced in beautiful, elegant handwriting, direct in tone, yet courteous. What disturbed Doran the most was not the content of the letter, but the manner in which it had appeared. No guard had seen the messenger. No servant had brought it. And he himself had found it on his desk at dawn, among reports and paperwork, as if it had always been there. That silent presence said more about the author than the written words themselves. Doran took a deep breath and placed the parchment on the table, next to an untouched glass of sand wine, just as Arianne entered, wrapped in silk, with that same blend of grace and pride that reminded him of her sister Elia. Father, she greeted, approaching with light steps. You were looking for me? Yes. Sit down, he said with a glance. I want you to be prepared. In a few days, we'll be receiving an important visitor. Who? She asked, taking a seat across from him. Daenerys Targaryen. Or rather, Daenerys Dracarys Targaryen. The exiled princess is coming to Dorne? Arianne asked, frowning, as if the announcement made no sense at all. Why? Doran closed his eyes for a moment, suppressing the sigh building in his chest. Of all his daughter's flaws, impulsive, impatient, stubborn like her mother, her lack of a clear understanding of the political game worried him the most. Because she is not just an exiled princess, he said, slowly opening his eyes to look directly at her. She is the de facto queen of Mirian, the recognized ruler in Karth, the wife of the conqueror of Yunkai and Astapor, of Vlad Dracul. Together they control cities, trade routes, armies, and dragons. Dragons? Arianne repeated with a half-smile, tilting her head. Come now, father. Those are just old wives' tales. 100 such tales, Doran replied calmly, yet firmly become a fact. Our spies have seen them in Mirian. A week ago, in Bravus. Unless you know something that my vast web of informants doesn't, we must act as though the dragons are real. Ariane didn't answer immediately. Her fingers toyed with the edge of her robe while her gaze wandered out the window. The name that truly lingered in her mind wasn't Daenerys, but Vlad. The shadowed figure behind Mirian's throne, the man surrounded by stories that brushed the edge of the impossible. I've heard more about him than about her, she admitted, without looking at her father. They say Vlad Drakal has no shadow, that he can walk through fire without burning, that he impales his enemies for fun. Are those things true? Doran didn't respond with scorn or irony. He simply rested both hands on the arms of his chair and met his daughter's gaze with seriousness. It was clear he did not appreciate jokes. What is true, he said, is that he appeared out of nowhere. That he commands the Dothraki, the deadliest cavalry in the known world. That he has raised an army without a family name, without a banner, without royal favor. He is intelligent, focused, and dangerous. Underestimating him would be a mistake Dorne cannot afford. Is he after the throne? Ariane asked. I don't know, but you think he is, she pressed. She knew her father well. I don't know, Doran repeated honestly. But what I do know is that his wife is coming to Dorne. Why she comes remains to be seen. But I hope that when she arrives, you will behave as the heir to this house should. Ariane smiled softly. The smile of an obedient daughter. Of course, father. I will welcome her as she deserves. Doran didn't respond immediately. He watched her for several seconds before sighing, but said nothing more. Ariane thought herself clever, but the sad truth was that she had begun playing the game without fully knowing the rules. Her intentions were so obvious to Doran that he almost pitied her. When she left him, Ariane walked through the halls of Sun's Pair without haste, letting the warmth of the marble beneath her feet relax her. Her mind, however, moved swiftly. The arrival of the exiled princess might be a complication, but she would not let that stop her. She didn't need dragons or armies. Her play had already begun. While her father wove alliances and crawled before lions and the throne, she was preparing her own crown. Soon, Myrcella would be queen. She had practically trained the girl for that purpose, and with her by her side, the Dornish would cry out her name. And with her on the throne, the lion would finally pay his blood debt. The sun burned high over the sandy-colored walls of Sun's Pair when the palace gates opened with ceremony. Daenerys had arrived without incident and had left the port without fanfare, accompanied only by a handful of men, her face hidden beneath a silk hood and veil. The escort that accompanied her stopped at the foot of the stairway, a few elite soldiers, Vlad's 5 blood riders, Missandei, and a small entourage of servants and porters. They were not many, but more than enough to ensure her comfort and safety. Although, in truth, she no longer needed protection. Daenerys walked at the front, flanked by the blood riders, her steps soft and measured. Everything about her radiated beauty and elegance. There was something about her walk that felt hypnotic, as if she didn't walk at all, but floated above the marble tiles. The white linen robe she wore seemed to move with a life of its own, and her nearly silver hair flowed like a cascade over her shoulders, barely hidden by the veil and hood. From the cool shadows of the entrance hall, Ariane saw her arrive alongside her father, and for a moment, just one, she felt small. Ariane was beautiful, and she knew it. In fact, she wielded it as a weapon. She knew what she stirred in both men and women: desire, respect, envy. How to make men kneel and women whisper with admiration. But that woman crossing the hall outshone her. Outshone everyone. Ariane looked at her, and she knew, even with her face covered, that she was in the presence of the most beautiful woman she had ever seen. And what she felt wasn't admiration, but envy, rage, desire. Everything she herself was used to provoking, and that infuriated her. Doran, ever the diplomat, inclined his head from his wheeled chair. It was all the courtesy he could offer. Chapter 63, Veiled Threats. Missandei, walking behind her queen, stepped forward to announce her. Before you stands Daenerys Drakal Targaryen, first of her name, rightful queen of the 7 kingdoms, the Stormborn, Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, the Unburnt, mother of dragons, breaker of chains, wife to the great conqueror of the East and queen of Mirian. Daenerys stopped at the foot of the low throne just as Doran raised a hand in welcome. Sun's Pair opens its gates to you, your grace, he said with a firm, serene voice. And House Martell offers you its hospitality. I accept it with gratitude, Prince Doran, she replied softly. A voice so perfect that Ariane felt a chill. Your name is honored beyond the narrow sea. The courtiers murmured respectfully. Doran nodded, then looked to his daughter. My daughter, Princess Ariane Martell. Ariane stepped forward with a slight bow and a warm smile. She wore a tight-fitting orange silk gown that accentuated her curves and contrasted beautifully with her sun-kissed skin. Her dark, wavy hair cascaded freely down her back. She was the living embodiment of Dornish beauty and, until 30 minutes ago, the most beautiful woman in the realm. Welcome to Dorne, your grace, she said with poise. I've heard so much about you, I feel as though I already know you. Daenerys observed her for a moment, then gave a slight smile that never reached her eyes. Dorne is known for raising strong and intelligent women. I'm pleased to see the rumors are true. There was a pause. Courteous, yet tense. Doran, in his infinite wisdom, remained silent, a spectator to that metaphorical duel of queens. It was Ariane who broke the silence with a soft, beautiful laugh. We were eagerly awaiting your arrival, though I confess, I half expected you to arrive riding a dragon. They say you have 4. Her tone was light, almost playful, but like all things in Dorne, it carried poison. Daenerys remained unbothered. She didn't even blink. We considered that option, she replied with serene calm and a dazzling smile. But it might have been perceived as a threat. Oh, it's impossible for you to threaten Dorne, Arianne replied, as if they were old friends. Is it, princess? Daenerys asked, amused, as if it were obvious. Arianne frowned, confused. Is what? Daenerys' smile could have melted stone. Impossible? Her tone remained kind, but it was unmistakably a threat. Arianne parted her lips in surprise, but ended up smiling with practiced grace. Doran narrowed his eyes, though he said nothing. And your husband? Arianne asked, as though making polite conversation. The infamous Lord Impaler. Many hoped to meet the man who makes warriors tremble from bravos to yeti. Sadly, he had a wedding to attend. Daenerys answered with mock regret. Doran raised a hand, cutting the tension with diplomacy. Your presence in Sunspear is an honor. We have much to discuss. If it pleases you, let us retire to the gardens, where the wine is chilled and the heat less oppressive. Daenerys nodded politely. Both royals gave her passage, though Arianne lingered behind, watching the queen walk away. Inside her, a storm brewed, a mix of jealousy, envy, and a creeping certainty. Daenerys was a threat to her plans. The hanging gardens of Sunspear offered a gentle respite beneath Dorne's burning skies. Flowers and fountains adorned the space, filling the air with a soft, pleasant scent, turning it into a haven of calm and beauty. It was tradition for palace lovers to walk there, enjoying the shade and serenity. Prince Doran moved forward in his chair, Arianne pushing him gently while they spoke casually with Daenerys. Missandei and the guards kept a respectful distance. Dorne has a relentless climate, Daenerys said with a light smile, glancing up at the flowering branches. But this place is as cool and beautiful as an oasis. That was the wish of its designer, Doran replied. A Targaryen princess, generations ago. Her name was also Daenerys. Then I thank my ancestors for their exquisite taste. Arianne laughed softly. And for beauty, of course. It seems, Your Grace, you inherited both. Some would sail across the sea to Mirian just to see your face. Please, Arianne, you'll make me blush, Daenerys said politely, not taking the bait, but not rejecting it either. They sat beneath a pergola covered in violet blossoms. The stone bench was cool in the shade, and a pitcher of wine with cups awaited on a nearby table. I was told your health keeps you confined to Sunspear, Daenerys commented, courteously. Gout is a cruel companion, Doran replied, shrugging with quiet grace. But I've learned to live with it. Daenerys carefully took out a small dark glass vial, sealed with red wax, and placed it on the table near the prince. This might help. It's a potion I was given in Essos. It has no side effects, but I was told it might cure your affliction. Doran observed it silently. He did not ask what it contained, though his gaze lingered on the red seal. He took it slowly and stored it away without comment. His expression remained calm, though his eyes had sharpened. It was her blood. Just a few drops, mixed with wine and sealed with heat. Vlad had said a few drops could heal wounds and illnesses. The only caution was ensuring the drinker didn't die immediately or they'd become his offspring. But Daenerys wasn't concerned. Doran was safe in Sunspear. I thank you, the prince said at last, in a measured tone. It's the least I owe you, for your hospitality and for the history your house shares with mine, Daenerys replied. Doran nodded. Silence lingered for a few moments as they drank a cup of wine, until Arianne broke it with a question. It's touching that you care so much for our family, Your Grace. Especially, considering you didn't grow up among us, Arianne said with false kindness. Daenerys did not lose her composure. Chapter 64, Doran Martell. I didn't grow up in Westeros, but it wasn't by choice, she replied softly. My family was hunted, killed, and scattered. If I wasn't born here, it's because the men who usurped my father's throne made sure I couldn't be. Arianne raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. And yet she said after a brief pause, her lips curling ever so slightly, you seem to have done quite well for yourself. Doran, who until then had kept his eyes fixed on his goblet, spoke up before the tension could rise. Indeed. Despite everything, the princess has flourished. Breaker of chains, Khaleesi, mother of dragons, you bear nearly as many titles as your husband. And yet, he remains a mystery. Few in Westeros know anything about him. He paused, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest of his chair. Imagine my surprise, he added, with a touch of irony and reproach, when I find a letter on my desk signed by none other than the Lord Impaler himself, and no one in the fortress knows how it got there. Daenerys let out a soft, genuine laugh, the first that didn't seem measured or diplomatic. For a moment, her smile lit up her face with a warmth that even disarmed Arianne, who stared at her, unsure whether to smile or frown. Doran, too, was briefly taken aback, as though he had seen a flower bloom under the desert sun. My husband, Daenerys said, eyes gleaming with something almost conspiratorial, has a weakness for the dramatic. Arianne tilted her head slightly, her eyes glinting with a playful and provocative spark. I must admit, your husband intrigues me, she said, letting her words linger like the scent of wine. What kind of man inspires so many stories? Is he truly as formidable as they say, or do the bards exaggerate? Daenerys took a small sip of wine, calmly. The bards usually fall short, she replied lightly, though without a smile. Arianne tilted her mouth into a sly grin. Her fingers played with the stem of her goblet as she let out a low chuckle. Perhaps you might introduce us someday. I'm sure he would appreciate Dornish hospitality, she ended with a sigh that was almost sensual. Her comment was met with silence. Daenerys set her cup down slowly and deliberately. Her eyes, once warm, turned cold. When she spoke, her voice was no longer cordial, but sharp and cutting. Unfortunately, she said, her voice now sharp as a dagger, my husband has little patience for social gatherings. He only tends to entertain one person. Her lips tightened into something that could never be called a smile. It's a pity that there are men and women who will never inspire that kind of devotion. So deep, so exclusive, so permanent. Ariane held her smile, though her fingers tightened slightly around her goblet. Doran swallowed slowly, his face still calm. Both of them sensed, though they couldn't explain why, that for a moment, they were standing before a predator. Doran cleared his throat, breaking the sudden tension. Perhaps it is time to set aside these trivialities, he said firmly, though not harshly. Tell us, Your Grace, what does your family seek in Dorne? Daenerys turned her gaze toward him. Her eyes softened again, though her bearing had lost the lightness from before. Now, she was a queen, not a guest. She set her goblet on the table, adjusted a strand of hair with a brief gesture, and straightened up, locking eyes with the man before her. I've come to see if the Martells are still loyal to my family, she answered seriously. And which family would that be? Targaryen? Dracarys? Doran replied with an inquisitive tone. Does it matter? My family is the only one with a legitimate claim to the throne. That is enough, she answered, somewhat defensively. My husband was very understanding regarding the name. He allowed me to keep mine, he even took it alongside his, out of respect. But our children will be Dracarys. Would you allow House Targaryen to disappear? Doran asked, incredulous. Not necessarily, Daenerys replied calmly. My relatives will carry on my family's legacy. But make no mistake, the Dracarys will be the new Dragon Lords. I owe Vlad more than I can say. It's the least I could do for him. Ariane then spoke with a mocking tone. Such heartfelt love, princess. Like something out of a tale. Daenerys didn't let the comment affect her. She simply turned back to Doran. Which relatives? The prince asked, a strange light in his eyes. Viserys? Gods, no. Daenerys seemed amused. My brother was executed a few years ago. He was completely mad, so I imprisoned him. Then he tried to rape a kitchen girl who brought him food. Vlad executed him. And you allowed that? Doran appeared stunned. For years, his plan had been to wed Viserys to Ariane. But now, that plan lay in ruins. Of course, Daenerys replied as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He didn't just threaten my life, he was a disgrace, and a threat to my children. Then, picking up her goblet again, she continued in a tone of subtle self-satisfaction. If you're worried about your arrangement with Sir William, I'm sure we can reach a new understanding. For the first time, Doran showed genuine surprise. He hadn't expected Daenerys to know the details of one of his most secret and dangerous arrangements. What arrangement? Asked Ariane, frowning. But her father signaled with a glance that they would speak later. If Viserys is dead, Doran continued, deliberately ignoring the previous subject, what relatives are you referring to? Then, he didn't trust Dorne enough to reveal that information. All those of Targaryen blood were hunted down and eliminated, either by the usurper or other forces, he said without a hint of tact. I assure you, princess, that you can trust my family, Ariane commented defensively, sounding even offended. After all, we have a history together. I barely trust myself, Princess Daenerys said playfully. And that's a sensible attitude, Doran remarked, glancing at his daughter, urging her to ease her tone. Ariane frowned, her voice laced with irony and disdain. If your family wants something from Dorne, perhaps you should start by offering a little more trust. Daenerys held her gaze without blinking, her smile failing to soften the chill in her words. My family doesn't need Dorne. Chapter 65, Allies. The silence that followed was thick. Doran raised an eyebrow, his expression contained. Are you certain of that? The queen did not waver. She straightened with even more elegance, delicately taking the cup before replying calmly, almost arrogantly. I have an army of 100,000 men, a fleet with 150 warships, and 4 dragons. No, I don't need you. But that doesn't mean I wish to cast you aside. Doran narrowed his eyes, weighing each word carefully. Ariane seemed ready to speak, but it was her father who responded first. Then, what do you seek in Dorne, if not support? Daenerys took a slow sip from her cup before answering, her voice firm and composed. Peace. Why make enemies when we could be allies? We can reclaim the throne without help, but we prefer to do it with as little bloodshed as possible. After all, winter is coming. The Prince of Dorne nodded slightly, though his expression grew more serious. Then tell me plainly, what do you want? The queen set the cup down with a soft clink, and her eyes locked on Doran's with intensity. I want you to publicly announce that I am the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, that Dorne supports me officially. I don't need soldiers, but a symbolic gesture, such as sending ships to transport troops, would be well received. Then she paused briefly. Her tone grew more solemn. And I also need you to hand over Myrcella Baratheon. The room seemed to grow colder at once. Doran didn't move, but his gaze darkened, while Ariane pressed her lips together in a mix of surprise and suspicion. Why? Revenge? Doran asked, his voice tense. I can swear the girl won't be harmed and will be treated with all due respect, Daenerys replied. My husband has plans for the last 2 Baratheons. They'll be useful when the time comes. Last 2? Ariane asked, confused. What about Joffrey? Daenerys only smiled with smug confidence, making it clear she wouldn't elaborate. Doran watched her for a moment before responding calmly, his voice steady. You've given us much to consider, princess. Please, enjoy Dorne's hospitality while we deliberate. Gladly. I'll stay a few days, she emphasized, clearly marking the limit of her time. I'll have the maids show you to your chambers. If you'll excuse us, Doran added as he walked away, Ariane following closely, frowning at his back. King's Landing. In a grand and ostentatious mansion in the upper district, a group of the most unlikely individuals gathered. A woman of exceptional beauty, with sleek black hair and a figure that would make any sensible man drool. A man in elegant attire, wearing a monocle and holding a cane, exuding refinement and wealth. A filthy beggar in rags, his greasy hair unwashed, but curiously, without a foul smell. Then a massive man, with arms like tree trunks and the weathered look of a mercenary or pirate. And lastly, a priest, clad in the clean white robes of the faith, adorned with the symbols of the seven hanging from his neck. They were all seated at the table, presided over by Edward, a tall man with black hair, pale skin, and a scar that ran down his cheek. They were the most important members of House Drakul, vampires, progeny of Vlad, turned years ago and sent to take control of different sectors of Westerosi society to prepare for their master's arrival. The five sat around the table, all in silence, waiting for someone who had not yet arrived. In the seat nearest to the empty throne sat Edward, tall and pale, his face marked by the scar across his cheek. He was the eldest of them, or at least the one who had borne the name the longest. All had been saved from something, death, slavery, or a meaningless life. Vlad had found them, given them power, a second life, and each of them, in their own way, had taken it. The woman seated next to the richly adorned empty chair, clearly reserved, looked around at those present. Lena Drakul had once been the sickly daughter of a Bravasi prostitute. Her mother died the day she gave birth, bleeding out in a filthy cot, with no one to help her or mourn her. Lena grew up in the dark corners of the city, surviving on scraps, without a figure to protect her or a roof to call her own. From a young age, she had to learn to avoid men who looked at her like garbage, and women who saw her as just another mouth to feed. She spent years plagued by illnesses that left her bedridden for weeks, and with hunger as her constant companion. When she was finally old enough to be looked at differently, she began to work. Not by choice, but because not doing so meant starving. The other girls told her to endure, that maybe someday someone would buy her for something better. But Lena knew better. She knew she'd end up like her mother, dead in a bed, with a child who wouldn't survive the night. Then Vlad appeared. The city already whispered about him, the foreigner who walked through Bravus, visiting the most expensive brothels without touching a single woman. Some said he was a eunuch, others a blood-drinking warlock. Lena didn't believe in rumors, but she could recognize someone who didn't belong. She saw him one afternoon, escorted by two dark-skinned riders, dressed in clothes not from Essos. He walked as if he feared nothing, as if the world belonged to him. Lena, used to stepping aside so clients could choose the more attractive girls, simply moved away. She wasn't worth offering, too thin, too pale, too sickly to appeal. She was no one. But Vlad didn't move aside. He stopped in front of her, looked her in the eyes, and smiled. It was the calmest, most confident smile Lena had ever seen. He said nothing, just offered her his hand. Lena, without knowing why, took it. They spent 3 days together. Not in a bed, but walking through canals, sitting in quiet alleys, sharing bread and wine. They talked about everything, about dreams she never had, about places he had seen. Vlad listened as if her every word mattered. He didn't touch her, didn't ask for anything, just spoke, with a patience Lena couldn't understand. It was enough. When he said he had to leave, Lena felt something break inside. She thought she would lose him forever, that she'd become invisible again. But Vlad, with that same calm, offered to take her with him. He didn't explain why, didn't promise love. He simply said she could stay by his side, if she wished. Lena didn't hesitate. For the first time, someone had offered her a hand. During the journey, Vlad told her of his nature. She didn't fully understand. He didn't use words she could link to anything familiar. He didn't call himself a god, or a demon, or a sorcerer, but he spoke of blood, of strength, of eternal life. Lena thought she was being prepared for some dark sacrifice, that maybe it had all been a cruel joke. But Vlad never raised his voice, never showed cruelty. He didn't want her life. He wanted to offer her a new one. She drank his blood not knowing if she'd wake again. And when she did, she was no longer the same. Her weak muscles were now firm. Her posture, once hunched from fatigue, stood tall. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She wasn't just stronger. It was as if, for the first time, her body reflected the soul that had survived all those years. She didn't cry. She only smiled. And so, when she was reborn as Lena Drakul, she swore to serve him. She wanted to be at his side, to share his bed, to be the only one he looked at. But Vlad did not seek love. He entrusted her with control of the brothels of King's Landing, a position of power, influence, and wealth. It wasn't a punishment. It was a mission. But to Lena, it was a disappointment. She didn't want riches or respect. She wanted Vlad. And still, she didn't give up. If he didn't love her now, he would later. She had time. Years. Centuries. Eternity. By her side, leaning against a beam, sat Drakul. He sharpened his nails with a small dagger, as if it were a calming ritual. He watched Lena with heavy eyes, not with desire, but with the tense focus of someone reliving something violent. Lena found him vulgar, too rough for her taste. But she didn't despise him. She knew what he had suffered. Chapter 66, Progeny. Cole had once been a son of the Iron Islands. One of those men born to kill and plunder. He lived without remorse until tragedy struck his own home. His sister, still a child, was raped and murdered by one of Balon Greyjoy's trusted captains. Cole tried to follow the rules. He went to his lord and asked for justice. But the killer was one of Greyjoy's most valuable captains, so he was declared innocent and the crime went unpunished. Furious, Cole took matters into his own hands. He managed only to slice off the man's ear before being wounded and forced to flee. Vlad found him months later in Pentos, drowning his grief in a filthy tavern. Cole was not only mourning his sister, but also bearing the weight of all the atrocities he himself had committed under the Kraken's banner. When Vlad approached him, Cole wasn't impressed by his presence. He was just another man, albeit a striking one. He offered a simple contract. Vlad needed seasoned sailors, and Cole needed coin to keep drinking until death. He accepted, planning to finish the job and vanish. But everything changed the day he saw Vlad fight. It was at the docks, against more than a dozen men. Cole had seen them thugs, killers. Vlad defeated them effortlessly. It wasn't a fight, it was a massacre. In that moment, Cole understood something. If he had wielded that power, his sister would still be alive. He could have had justice. He could have destroyed everyone who had failed him. Vlad knew it. And so, days later, he offered Cole the same thing he had offered Lena: power, strength, redemption. Cole accepted. Not out of loyalty or love. He did it out of hatred. For the promise of vengeance. Since then, every night he dreamed of returning to the Iron Islands and burning them to the ground. That was the oath he swore when he was reborn as a Dracal. And Vlad, with a calm smile, had told him that day would come. The other men seated there didn't have stories nearly as tragic as Cole's. Still, they all had something in common, a reason to follow Vlad. Edward, for example, had been a nameless slave, born and raised on a spice plantation east of Karth. His entire life had consisted of obeying, hauling weight, and staying silent. He'd never had a chance to fight for anything, let alone for himself. Vlad found him chained in a cage, displayed in a slave market like any other piece of merchandise. He asked no questions, he simply bought him, broke the chains before everyone, and offered him a choice: be free and go his own way, or follow him. And Edward, without hesitation, chose to follow. Since then, he had never left his side. He wasn't the smartest, nor the strongest, but no one doubted his loyalty. To him, Vlad wasn't just a savior, he was the only figure of power who had ever treated him with respect. And so, even though he wasn't born for war or intrigue, he had been one of the first to accept the embrace. Because if Vlad needed him eternal he would be. Dorian, on the other hand, was a different story. From the moment he entered the hall, his appearance gave him away: well-cut clothes, carefully groomed hair, discreet yet expensive jewelry. He was the type of man who knew how to speak so others said yes without knowing why. He had been a moneylender in Bravus, a known name among merchants and minor houses. For years he lent money to those in need and collected it with brutal interest. But his mistake had been trusting the wrong person. One of his partners betrayed him, arranged a kidnapping, and sold him into slavery in Volantis, taking over the business and stripping him of everything: his wealth, his position, his contacts. It was Vlad who rescued him, not out of compassion, but because he saw his value. They talked for hours. Dorian told his story without embellishment or excuses. Vlad explained what he planned to do in Westeros and how he needed someone like him to move gold, debts, and names from the shadows. Dorian didn't care about blood, war, or dragons. But he did care about power. And Vlad offered real, lasting power. He accepted the deal without hesitation. Now he had youth, influence, and a position that even before his fall he would have considered unthinkable. There was only one thing that bothered him: he couldn't betray Vlad, not even if he wanted to. But he compensated for that frustration with wine, women, and feasts that would have shamed any Westerosi noble. Malik was a different piece altogether. At first glance, he looked like a beggar. Worn clothes, thin face, nervous eyes. But under that facade was a sharp mind, trained from childhood to listen, memorize, and survive. He had been one of Varys' little birds, trained to move in silence, to slip through shadows, to know when a conversation was mere chatter and when it held a valuable secret. But as the years passed, he grew. His voice deepened, his movements became clumsier, and he stopped going unnoticed. He ended up living off what he could steal or extort, always on the move, always hungry. Vlad found him in one of those nameless cities, filthy and exhausted, but with ears still sharp. They reached an agreement quickly. Malik knew how information networks worked, and Vlad needed one of his own. He offered him safety, a home, a purpose, and eternal life. Unlike others, Malik didn't hesitate for a second. He didn't care about power or glory. He just wanted to survive, and Vlad guaranteed that. Now he ran a network of informants that stretched across several cities, and no one suspected the quiet beggar who sometimes sat at temple gates asking for a coin. Lars was perhaps the most unexpected of them all. An actor, nothing more. He had worked for years in small traveling troupes, moving from town to town, playing minor roles. But he had talent, and Vlad recognized it. He saw him perform once in a small square, playing a priest comforting a town ravaged by war. He was convincing, so much so that the very villagers offered him bread and shelter without realizing it was all an act. Vlad approached him that same night. Not to applaud, but to offer him a much more enduring role. He turned him and gave him clear instructions: infiltrate the faith of the Seven, rise through the ranks, and slowly sow chaos. Lars accepted, and gladly. He was proud of his acting skills, and now he was given a truly meaningful part. He became a model priest, always ready to help, to console, to bless. He had already reached the rank of Septon, and if things continued, he would soon be one of the most influential voices in the faith. And now, they were all there, in that luxurious mansion, sitting in silence, each with their story and their reasons. All waiting for a mysterious guest, though they all suspected who it would be. Edward suddenly stood up with the same calm and dignity that always characterized him. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt with an automatic gesture before raising his voice, clear and solemn, projecting every word with confidence. "My lords, my ladies," he began, looking at each of them with a slight nod. "Our Lord will arrive in a few moments. I ask you to remain composed and receive him with the respect he deserves." A soft murmur swept through the room. "So it was true?" Lena whispered with near reverent tone. "I thought he wouldn't come in person. He doesn't gather everyone unless it's important," added Cole in a deep voice, arms crossed. "But that he shows up himself. And how will he arrive?" Dorian asked, unable to hide his curiosity. Edward didn't respond immediately. He simply gestured for them to follow him. He led them through a silent corridor to an adjoining room, completely empty except for a large stone platform in the center and a small brazier alight. The flame was dim and calm. "Wait here," Edward said in a tone that allowed no argument. Then he turned to the brazier, drew a small dagger, and without ceremony, cut the palm of his hand. "What are you doing?" asked a voice in a low, tense tone. "Calling my lord," Edward replied without looking back. The blood dripped onto the flame. Instantly, the fire roared violently, as if fed with oil. The flames rose, casting red and orange glows that painted shadows on the walls. Everyone took a step back, instinctively. Had he done this before? Lars asked, a mix of fear and fascination in his voice. "No," Lena answered, eyes fixed on the fire. "This is new." The fire began to take shape. A silhouette emerged from the flames, at first vaguely human, then more defined, a being of fire, with eyes glowing like coals, rose like a god before them, and no one dared move. The flames began to recede, revealing flesh, muscles, bones, skin, each part of his body formed before their eyes, as if the fire wove Vlad from within. Finally, when the last flicker vanished, he was there, tangible, dressed in black, calm and lethal. Vlad looked at them, and a subtle smile crossed his face. "It's a pleasure to see you, ladies and gentlemen," he said in a deep voice. "Now come. We have a wedding to attend." Chapter 67, Among Monsters and Whores. 4 people stood lined up in front of a bed in one of Littlefinger's many brothels. 3 pale-skinned women of differing builds, and a tall, handsome blonde man dressed with elegance. The man stood to the side, observing the entire situation and ready to fulfill any request from his distinguished guests. Be it more wine, more girls, or less clothing. After all, he ran the brothel, and it wasn't every day he hosted such illustrious company. The women remained motionless as a man with olive skin and an attractive but weathered appearance slowly circled them, observing them closely. On the bed in front of them, a dark-skinned woman with black curls cascading down her back watched the scene with evident delight. She was beautiful, without a doubt. The man continued circling the women as if analyzing them thoroughly. He stepped closer to the tallest one, with dark hair and her gaze fixed on the floor. He couldn't tell whether it was out of shyness or fear. After all, not every whore got the chance to meet the Prince of Dorne. "Look at this one. Isn't she lovely?" Oberyn Martell pointed out to the love of his life, Elaria Sand, who was lying on the bed, waiting for her lover to choose a girl. Elaria enjoyed the show, watching as her husband began to undress the young woman, who still stared at the floor, visibly nervous. "She is lovely," Elaria commented between sips of wine. "But too pale." Oberyn nearly laughed. His wife never bit her tongue. "In the capital, they prefer pale skin," he explained, running a finger down the girl's arm. "It means they don't work the fields." He liked them that way, too. Sensing the girl's nervousness, Oberyn leaned down to whisper playfully into her ear. "Do I scare you?" "And no, my lord," she stammered. Oberyn doubted she'd relax enough to make the night enjoyable. But in the end, this was more of a gift for Elaria than for him. "What do you think?" he asked. "She's shy. Shy girls bore me," Elaria replied, emptying her cup in one gulp. Oberyn then turned his attention to the girl beside her, short, fair-skinned, and brown-haired. Unlike the first, this one didn't look away from Elaria. On the contrary, she devoured her with her eyes. Elaria seemed to notice, too, and held her gaze with challenge. Oberyn approached the girl with a playful smile, and with a single tug, undid the only knot holding up her light dress. The fabric slid gently to the floor, leaving her completely naked in front of them all. While caressing her generous backside, he whispered in a teasing tone, savoring the softness of her skin. "You, on the other hand, seem a little naughty, don't you?" he said with his usual charm before turning to his wife, squeezing the girl's buttocks with intent. "I think she likes you." Elaria watched the scene with clear delight. Her sly, feline smile was the same one that always excited Oberyn. "She has good taste," she said, letting out a brief giggle that only heightened the tension in the room. The girl, now confident she had their attention, pressed her body against Oberyn's with more assurance. "You're not shy, are you?" he asked, dragging out the words. Feeling in control, the girl doubled down, twisting her body to lift her own foot to head height. The acrobatic move earned her an approving laugh from Elaria. "Not shy at all," exclaimed the bastard, clearly aroused. Oberyn smiled, pleased to have found a girl that pleased his wife. "Do you like women?" he asked, continuing to caress the curve of her back. When they're like her, my lord, the girl replied with a shameless smile. Elaria didn't wait any longer. She leaned in and began kissing the girl's naked body slowly, caressing her with an intensity that completely captivated Oberyn's attention. The prince, entranced by the scene, barely turned his gaze to speak to the young man running the brothel. Very well, my lady, the young man said sweetly, gesturing to the other girls to get dressed. Elaria laughed playfully before correcting him. I'm no lady. A courtesy of the establishment, he tried to explain. And everywhere else, a lie, Elaria snapped, enjoying his discomfort. Let's use the right words. She pinched the girl's pink nipple. I'm a bastard. She's a whore. Her gaze fixed on the young man. And you? A pimp? The blonde man could only smile ironically, knowing there was no way to best a woman like Elaria. Anyone else? He asked, changing the subject. Elaria raised her hand and signaled to her husband, who seemed to snap out of the trance he'd fallen into watching her fondle another girl. The other girls can leave. But you stay, she declared, pointing at the young man in charge. My lord, I'm not for sale. But Oberyn cut him off with disdain, not even bothering to look at him. Everyone who works for Littlefinger is for sale. He hadn't come just for the girls. He wanted the full package. To satisfy all his appetites. To drown the poison boiling in his blood. Without these moments of escape, he didn't know how he could endure that damned, stinking city. King's Landing disgusted him. He hated the family sitting on the throne, every Lannister bastard with their golden smiles, and he despised anything that remotely reminded him of Elia. The only reason he'd come to this rat's nest was to watch. To measure strength. To know how long until his brother could move the pieces and finally make all those who owed them Elia's blood pay. Just as he was about to start undressing the handsome young man, his trained ear caught a melody that chilled his blood. Little by little, it grew louder until even Elaria could hear it. She quickly released the girl's lips and rose, terrified. Not out of fear for Oberyn but for what he would do. Oberyn, she tried to stop him, but the man had already darted out of the private room like an arrow. After all, the melody was the Rains of Castamere. Chapter 68, Mind Games. Oberyn didn't have to look for long. Just in the room next to his, two gold cloaks were enjoying wine while two girls sat on their laps, and one of them was belting out the lyrics to the Rains of Castamere at the top of his lungs. Perhaps because of the wine, or perhaps the company, they didn't notice the man who slid open the room's doors until he was already inside. One of them looked him up and down before adopting a smug, condescending expression. To men of the Westlands, Dorne was a land of peasants and bastards, nothing like the elitist hills of the Crag or the splendor of Casterly Rock. Lost, are you? He asked, as if he had found a particularly repugnant pest. Forgive my rudeness, Oberyn replied in a measured and polite tone, though with a provoking smile. We don't see many Lannisters in my land. We don't see many Dornishmen in the capital either, the man mocked. We don't like the smell, Oberyn replied, his smirk full of scorn. Suddenly, Elaria entered the room, followed by the brothel's manager, trailing after the unpredictable prince. She took Oberyn by the arm, trying to talk him down. Gods, look at that woman, said the other soldier, who had remained quiet so far, his eyes devouring Elaria. Why waste her on a Dornishman? Give her a bottle of oil and a goat. The two men burst out laughing, but everyone else in the room wore a serious face. The prostitutes, who had been sitting on the soldiers' laps, recognized the signs. They immediately got up and scurried away. Elaria, who had been holding Oberyn's arm just moments earlier, let go. Even she didn't take insults to her homeland lightly, and a prince of Dorne certainly wouldn't either. Oberyn smiled pleasantly as he walked slowly toward the soldiers' table. Do you know why everyone hates the Lannisters? He said, more to himself than to them. The two men stood up, tense, expecting trouble. But Oberyn went on. You think your gold and your lions make you better than the rest, he said, eyeing the swords resting against the table. But want to hear a secret? You're not better than anyone. You're just a pair of very slow men with your swords. Everyone in the room was completely still, bracing for the inevitable. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Oberyn needed only the smallest excuse. Killing Lannisters right in the capital, knowing they could do nothing about it, would bring him more satisfaction than the most exquisite orgy. The tension broke abruptly when a deep, theatrical voice echoed through the room. How right you are? A tall, blonde, muscular man entered as if he owned the place. He wore only a fitted silk shirt and leather trousers, his hair tied back in a loose ponytail. He watched the scene with clear amusement. The brothel's manager rushed forward to get him out of there. The situation was bad enough without some drunken noble adding to the chaos. My lord, this is a private room. He couldn't finish the sentence before the man simply gestured toward his face. Sleep, he said in a dull voice, and the boy collapsed to the floor like a marionette with its strings cut. The whole thing felt unbelievably surreal. Oberyn, who seconds before had been ready for a fight, now felt a knot of unease in his stomach. Something about the situation felt profoundly unnatural. Elaria also seemed unsettled by the man's appearance, but more so by his apparent ability to put someone to sleep with a single word. They think they're better than everyone, the stranger said, but this time with a persuasive, almost hypnotic tone. Even though every part of Oberyn screamed that something was wrong, his mind insisted everything was normal. Even when the man literally dissolved into mist and reappeared behind the frozen Lannisters, the scene still felt perfectly acceptable. Two pieces of arrogant, condescending trash, he muttered as he grabbed one of their chins, examining him like a specimen. Oberyn nodded involuntarily, as if he agreed with every word. I bet they're monsters too, the man went on. Maybe they were here during the sack of King's Landing? What do you think, Oberyn? Yes, bastards. I should kill them, the prince replied, like in a trance. Exactly, let's kill them, the stranger declared, placing his hands around the men's necks. But then Ellaria snapped out of it. She shook her head forcefully and rushed to rouse her husband as well. Oberyn! She shook him hard. The prince broke from the trance instantly, disoriented. But as the full weight of the situation settled over him, he grasped the danger. He moved Ellaria behind him, shielding her with his body, then questioned the man through gritted teeth. Who are you? What did you do to us? Vlad rolled his eyes. They had ruined all the fun. The truth was, he had come to the brothel on a whim, after watching those same men beat a beggar boy within an inch of his life. He wasn't exactly a saint who would save every unfortunate soul, but he also wasn't going to let these bastards enjoy their night of wine and whores. And his encounter with Prince Oberyn, whom he knew had arrived in the capital that afternoon, was a golden opportunity to make a memorable impression. Oh, come now, Oberyn. Don't be like that. It was just a little family joke, Vlad said with a smile. Family? Oberyn asked, confused. On my wife's side, of course, Vlad shrugged. And who is your wife, my lord? Ellaria asked, calmer now. The stranger didn't seem hostile toward them. Vlad's smile turned predatory. Daenerys Targaryen. The Dornish couple's eyes widened. They immediately recognized the man who had inspired so many tales. The Impaler Lord Oberyn murmured, and his expression shifted into a defiant, jubilant smile, as if meeting this legendary monster in the flesh was a cause for celebration. In the flesh and blood, Vlad gave a theatrical bow, grinning. He already had the feeling he'd get along well with Oberyn Martell. The way the man stared back at him with open challenge made it clear he would be great entertainment. Chapter 69, Monsters with Manners. Apparently, the whole situation had stopped feeling dangerous and turned into a social visit. Vlad had simply knocked the two Lannisters unconscious before tossing them into a corner of the room like sacks of potatoes, and Oberyn and Ellaria served themselves wine as if nothing had happened, watching his movements with interest. So, what's the terrifying Lord Impaler doing in the capital? Shouldn't you be bathing in virgin blood and eating babies? She asked playfully. Vlad practically rolled his eyes as he sat down on a cushioned window seat. Damn priests. They come up with the least creative stories, he muttered, annoyed. The Faith of the Seven had done its job of alerting everyone about the monster looming over Westeros, most likely paid in Lannister gold as revenge for the massacre at the twins. Are you denying the baby part? Ellaria asked with mock innocence. Ellaria? Oberyn feigned scandal. Don't interrogate our distinguished guest like that. Although, his smile turned wolfish, now that you mention it. Please, Vlad said, feigning indignation. Virgins are best enjoyed in other ways, and babies are only pleasant when they're yours, he added with a laugh. Ellaria swayed her hips deliberately as she walked over and sat on her husband's lap. Well, about babies, she said while pouring more wine and letting her hand graze Vlad's, I prefer making them to taking care of them. That part has always been the most fun to me. Darling, Oberyn placed a hand on his heart. Are you flirting with my political relative? I'm just exploring potential strategic alliances, she replied with a feline smile. Vlad watched the exchange with amused exasperation. Oberyn leaned back in his seat, eyes gleaming with a mix of curiosity and sarcasm. So tell me, Lord Impaler, he pronounced the title with a mocking grin, what brings you to this rotten city? Come to enjoy our hospitality? Vlad accepted the cup with a grateful nod, his lips curved in amusement. Call me Vlad, please. Lord Impaler is far too grandiose, he said, taking a sip of wine. And I came for the wedding, of course. The event of the century, isn't it? An arrogant king, a resigned bride, wine everywhere, blood guaranteed. You expect blood? Ellaria asked, tilting her head. I don't expect it, Vlad replied softly, but I'd be disappointed if there wasn't any. That trick you pulled earlier, Oberyn asked, curious, while twirling his dagger. What the hell was that? Vlad waved his hand dismissively, like brushing away a fly. Oh, that. Just a little mind game, almost a parlor trick. Nothing a man of your insight couldn't grasp. Magic? Oberyn insisted, now frowning slightly. I studied what scraps I could find at the Citadel, but that didn't look anything like what you do. Those idiots wouldn't recognize real magic if it burned their feet. They're too scared of it, Vlad said with scorn, though he noticed Oberyn still looked unconvinced. Really? He raised an eyebrow. In a world with dragons, faceless men, and skin changers, you doubt magic? Ellaria let out a soft laugh, amused by the growing tension. The difference is, you're scarier than a skin changer, she said. And I won't believe in dragons until I see one. Oh, you will, Vlad replied with a strangely tender smile. In fact, my wife is meeting with your brother right now. You'll be hearing from them soon enough. Oberyn narrowed his eyes. It wasn't a threat, but still, he worried for his brother. Good luck to your wife trying to negotiate with Doran, he said, chuckling. From what he knew, Daenerys was a petite woman with a reputation for being kind. Vlad laughed openly. I'd worry about your brother. As you'll learn one day, my wife is pure fire. Oberyn studied him, trying to read between the lines. But he seemed to change the subject as Ellaria offered him a sip from her cup. So what are you then? A blood mage? A skin changer? Vlad looked him straight in the eyes, his expression calm but firm, as if savoring the mystery. Let's say, I'm a man on a mission. And what mission is that? Oberyn asked, genuinely curious. Vlad looked at him while sipping his wine. His reply was serious and direct. Peace in our time. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, full of possibilities. Finally, Oberyn raised his cup. To monsters with manners, then. And to snakes and poison, Vlad replied, clinking his cup with a soft chime. Oberyn stood with his wife and extended an arm in a grand gesture. Well, since we're here, he proposed with a lascivious smile, how about spending the afternoon with us? Wine, good company. He gestured to the women still in the room and all the delights this place has to offer. I'm not interested in whores, Vlad said simply, though with a tone laced with amusement. And if you want to make sure Sun's pair doesn't turn to ashes one night, I'd avoid offering me prostitutes in front of my wife, even if she's across the sea. Alleria and Oberyn laughed heartily, but they didn't understand Vlad wasn't joking. I'm sure we can find activities to enjoy together in the capital. If not, we could take you as our guest to the wedding, Alleria suggested with a smile. Oh, that won't be necessary. I have a wedding invitation, Vlad said, pulling out a golden scroll. But sadly, they got my name wrong. What a shame, he added playfully. Oberyn burst out laughing. Please, don't stray too far from us. Otherwise, it'll be unbearably boring. No worries, I feel the same. In fact, allow me to invite you to dinner, Vlad said, standing and motioning toward the door. And what about them? Alleria asked, pointing at the two soldiers and the poor pimp still lying on the floor, fast asleep. Vlad shrugged. The boy will wake up in a few hours, after the best sleep of his life, he replied, then gestured to the soldiers. As for them, they'll die. And the bodies? Oberyn asked, slightly uncomfortable with the idea of leaving two corpses in his favorite brothel. Vlad gave a smug smile that both Alleria and Oberyn found equally attractive. What bodies? He asked innocently. Both Dornish looked toward the corner where the men had been, and found nothing, even though they'd been there just seconds ago. Oberyn looked at him, clearly impressed, then chuckled. Okay, now that trick you'll have to teach me.